Thomas Gray glanced at himself in the mirror, adjusting his tie as a warm smile crept across his face. It was a crisp autumn morning, and sunlight streamed through the windows of his modest yet cozy home. Today was the day he'd been looking forward to for what felt like forever, his wedding day. After years of being a single father to his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, he had finally found someone who made him believe in love again. It hadn't always been easy for Thomas. After his first marriage ended in heartbreak, he'd thrown himself into his work and focused on raising Sophie. He was a respected business owner in his town, known for his dedication to his clients and his steady, reliable demeanor. But deep down, he knew something was missing. There were times when he'd come home to an empty house after a long day, and the silence would weigh on him, reminding him that he was alone. That all changed 2 years ago when he met Isabella Reed at a business conference in the city. Isabella was sophisticated and confident, with a smile that could light up a room. She worked in public relations and was just as ambitious and driven as Thomas. They connected almost immediately, drawn to each other's energy and passion. For Thomas, it was as though she had reignited a part of him he'd thought was gone forever. Over the course of their whirlwind romance, Isabella had charmed not only Thomas but also many of his friends and colleagues. She seemed like the perfect addition to his life, a strong, beautiful woman who shared his goals and ambitions. He admired her elegance and the way she carried herself, and he was excited to build a future together. But if there was one person who hadn't fully warmed to Isabella, it was Sophie. Thomas knew Sophie was a cautious and thoughtful girl. She had always been shy around new people, preferring to observe them quietly before opening up. From the beginning, she had been polite to Isabella, but there was a distance there, a hesitation that Thomas couldn't quite understand. He hoped it was just a matter of time before Sophie grew comfortable with Isabella, seeing her as part of the family. Today, however, was a day for joy and new beginnings, and Thomas was determined to put aside any lingering doubts. Isabella had agreed to a simple yet elegant ceremony at a nearby church, followed by a reception with close friends and family. He looked forward to seeing Sophie in her lavender dress, her favorite color, and watching as his family grew by one. He was pulled out of his thoughts by the soft knock on his bedroom door. Turning around, he saw Sophie standing there, dressed in a lovely lavender dress that brought out the sparkle in her big brown eyes. She clutched a small bouquet of lavender and white roses, matching the decorations they'd chosen for the ceremony. "Dad, are you ready?" Sophie asked, her voice quiet but filled with a hint of excitement. Thomas walked over to her, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "I am, sweetheart. And look at you, you're beautiful. Are you excited?" Sophie nodded, but there was something hesitant in her gaze. "Yeah, I am. I hope everything goes perfectly today." "It will," Thomas reassured her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Today is the beginning of something wonderful. For both of us." Sophie gave him a small smile, though her eyes still held a flicker of doubt. Thomas brushed it off, convinced it was just nerves. He hugged her tightly, feeling grateful to have her by his side. After a quick breakfast, they left for the church, where the rest of the wedding party was already gathered. The church was filled with beautiful flower arrangements and soft candlelight, casting a warm glow over the pews. Friends, family, and colleagues filled the seats, murmuring in anticipation as they waited for the ceremony to begin. Thomas took his place at the altar, his heart pounding with excitement as he waited for Isabella to walk down the aisle. He couldn't believe this moment had finally arrived, that he was about to start a new chapter in his life with someone he loved deeply. The music began to play, and all eyes turned toward the back of the church. There, framed by the open doors, stood Isabella, radiant in a flowing white gown that shimmered under the light. Her confidence and grace captivated everyone in the room as she began her walk down the aisle. Her gaze locked onto Thomas's. As she moved closer, Thomas felt a swell of emotions, a mixture of love, hope, and a sense of completeness he hadn't felt in years. Isabella's smile was warm, and she looked every bit the woman he had fallen in love with. But just as she reached the halfway point down the aisle, a sudden movement caught Thomas's eye. He looked to the side and saw Sophie, her face pale and her expression tense, darting down the aisle with something clutched tightly in her hand. The guests murmured, surprised by the unexpected interruption. As Sophie hurried toward Isabella and held out a small, folded note, Isabella froze, her eyes narrowing as she looked down at the note in Sophie's hand. She glanced back at Thomas, a flicker of confusion and discomfort crossing her face. Thomas watched, a knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't like Sophie. She was shy, quiet, and reserved, certainly not the type to interrupt a ceremony. Something was wrong. Taking the note, Isabella hesitated, then unfolded it, her face visibly changing as she read the words. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock and then something darker, more complex. Without saying a word, she handed the note to Thomas, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. Thomas's heart raced as he took the note, glancing down at Sophie, who had returned to his side and was clutching his hand tightly. Confused and growing increasingly anxious, he unfolded the note, his hands shaking as he read the words written on the small piece of paper. The words hit him like a blow, stealing his breath. The silence in the church was almost oppressive as he processed what he was reading. His mind spun with disbelief, anger, and a pain that went deeper than anything he'd ever felt. He looked up, meeting Isabella's gaze, but he no longer saw the woman he thought he knew. In her eyes, he saw guilt and fear, a confirmation that the words on the note were not some cruel joke. But the truth. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, murmuring in confusion as they sensed the tension in the air. Thomas, struggling to maintain his composure, folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. He turned to the priest, his voice barely a whisper but filled with emotion. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "There won't be a wedding today." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, and she took a hesitant step toward him. "Thomas, I can explain," she stammered, her voice pleading, but Thomas raised a hand, silencing her. "Not here, not now." With that, he turned away, his heart heavy as he took Sophie's hand. She looked up at him, worry etched on her young face, and he forced a small, reassuring smile for her sake. As they walked down the aisle together, leaving a stunned and silent crowd behind, Thomas felt the weight of betrayal settle over him. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had planned to marry, had shattered his world with a single piece of paper. But as he stepped out of the church, breathing in the cool air, he felt a glimmer of clarity. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he and Sophie would face it together, free from the shadow of deception. And as they walked away from what should have been his wedding, Thomas understood that sometimes the hardest truths come from the most unexpected sources, and that his daughter, in her innocence, had saved him from a lifetime of heartache. Thomas and Sophie walked away from the church in silence, leaving behind friends, family, and a woman who, just minutes ago, he had planned to spend the rest of his life with. The cold reality of betrayal clung to him like a weight, but he pushed down his emotions, focusing instead on the gentle grip of his daughter's hand in his. Sophie, though only 8, had an instinctive understanding of her father's turmoil. She walked beside him quietly, her face a mixture of confusion and sadness. As they reached the car, Thomas took a deep breath, releasing Sophie's hand and turning to look at her. He wanted to say something, to explain, but the right words wouldn't come. "Daddy, are you okay?" Sophie asked softly, her voice laced with worry. Thomas knelt down in front of her, meeting her gaze. "I'm okay, sweetie," he lied, trying to keep his tone steady. "Thank you for showing me the note. I know it must have been hard for you to do that." Sophie looked down, fidgeting with her fingers. "I didn't want to ruin anything, but I didn't know what else to do." Thomas pulled her into a gentle hug, feeling a surge of gratitude for his daughter's innocence and honesty. "You did the right thing, Sophie. Sometimes grown-ups don't see things as clearly as kids do." Sophie hugged him back, clinging to him as if she understood the gravity of the situation. When they finally pulled apart, Thomas opened the car door, helping her inside before getting into the driver's seat himself. He sat there for a moment, staring blankly at the steering wheel as the events of the day replayed in his mind. What had started as the happiest day of his life had unraveled into a nightmare. The note Sophie had found, the note that revealed Isabella's affair with his business partner, Richard, felt like a cruel twist of fate. He couldn't believe how thoroughly he had been deceived. The thought of Isabella, the woman he had trusted and loved, betraying him in such a calculated way was almost too much to bear. As he started the car, his mind raced with questions he knew he wouldn't have answers to. At least not today. For now, he needed to get away from the church, from the guests, from the broken dreams that lay behind them. Where are we going, Daddy? Sophie asked, breaking the silence. Home, Thomas replied, his voice steady, though his heart felt anything but. Back at home, Thomas sat on the living room couch, staring at the walls in silence. Sophie had gone to her room, sensing that her father needed space. But he knew he couldn't avoid talking to her forever. She was too young to fully understand what had happened, but he needed to make sure she felt safe and reassured in the midst of the chaos. A knock on the door startled him out of his thoughts. Standing up, he opened the door to find his best friend, Mark, standing there with a concerned expression on his face. Hey, man, I thought I'd check on you, Mark said, his voice low and gentle. Thomas managed a weak smile, stepping aside to let him in. Thanks for coming by. It's been a lot. They sat down on the couch, the silence thick with unspoken words. Finally, Mark spoke. I'm so sorry, Thomas. I don't know what to say. Thomas shook his head, his gaze distant. I don't know what I was thinking. Mark, I trusted her. I was ready to build a life with her. And now, it feels like my whole world just came crashing down. Mark placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You couldn't have known. Sometimes, people hide their true selves behind a mask. You saw the person she wanted you to see. Thomas's jaw clenched as he nodded. But how could I have missed it? All the signs, the secrecy. The times she seemed distant. I brushed it all off, thinking it was just wedding stress. I wanted to believe in her. And now I feel like a fool. You're not a fool, Thomas, Mark said firmly. You loved her. You gave her your trust. And she took advantage of that. But that's on her, not you. Thomas took a deep breath, absorbing his friend's words. He knew Mark was right. But the sting of betrayal was still fresh, like a wound that hadn't begun to heal. What about Sophie? Mark asked after a moment. How is she handling all this? Thomas looked down, his expression softening. She's stronger than I realized. She found that note, Mark. She came down the aisle and handed it to me in front of everyone. I can't imagine how hard that must have been for her. Mark nodded thoughtfully. She loves you, Thomas. She probably sensed that something wasn't right and wanted to protect you. A sense of gratitude filled Thomas's chest, mingling with the sadness and frustration. His daughter's innocent loyalty had saved him from a lifetime of heartache. And he knew he would do everything in his power to make sure she felt secure and loved. Even in the aftermath of this disaster. I think I just need some time to process all of this, Thomas said finally, his voice tired, to figure out what comes next. Mark squeezed his shoulder, offering a comforting smile. Take all the time you need. I'm here for you, and so is everyone who cares about you. You're not alone in this. Thomas nodded, grateful for his friend's support. As Mark left, Thomas sat in the quiet of the house, letting the reality of his situation sink in. That evening, Thomas knocked gently on Sophie's bedroom door before opening it. She was sitting on her bed, hugging a stuffed animal, her face thoughtful and somber. Hey, kiddo, he said softly, sitting on the edge of her bed. Can we talk? Sophie looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with questions. Are you mad at me, Daddy? Thomas's heart broke a little at the worry in her voice. He reached over, taking her hand in his. No, sweetheart, I'm not mad at you at all. I'm proud of you. You did the right thing by showing me that note. You were very brave. Sophie's eyes filled with relief, and she squeezed his hand. I didn't mean to ruin the wedding. I thought you should know. Thomas nodded, his voice gentle. You did the right thing. Sophie, sometimes, telling the truth can be hard, but it's always the best thing to do. I know today was confusing and scary, but I'm so grateful to have you by my side. Sophie looked down, her fingers tracing patterns on the bedspread. Are you sad? Thomas's throat tightened. Yes, sweetie, I am. I thought I knew Isabella, but it turns out she wasn't the person I believed her to be. It hurts, but we'll be okay. You and me, together. Sophie nodded, a small smile breaking through her solemn expression. I'm glad it's just us again. Daddy, I like it that way. Thomas felt a surge of warmth at her words, realizing that even though the dream of a perfect family had shattered, he still had the one person who meant everything to him. He pulled Sophie into a hug, holding her close as they sat together, finding comfort in each other's presence. The days that followed were a mix of reflection and slow healing. Thomas spent more time with Sophie, focusing on their bond and creating new memories together. They took trips to the park, baked cookies in the kitchen, and even started a small garden in their backyard. Activities that allowed Thomas to reconnect with the simple joys of life. Isabella, meanwhile, tried reaching out, leaving messages and sending letters in an attempt to explain herself. But Thomas knew he couldn't trust her words. The betrayal had cut too deep, and there was no going back. He needed to close that chapter and move on, not just for his sake, but for Sophie's. Through therapy and conversations with close friends, Thomas began to process the pain and anger he felt. He reflected on his own choices, acknowledging how his desire for companionship had blinded him to the warning signs. Slowly, he learned to forgive himself, understanding that vulnerability was part of what made him human. Months passed, and as the seasons changed, so did Thomas's outlook on life. He no longer saw the world through the lens of betrayal. Instead, he focused on the love he shared with his daughter, the strength he had found within himself, and the support of those who truly cared for him. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Sophie leaned against his shoulder, her small hand resting in his. "Daddy, are you happy?" she asked, her voice curious and hopeful. Thomas smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. "Yes, sweetheart, I am. I have you, and that's all I need." Sophie beamed, and they sat together in silence, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. In that moment, Thomas realized that life, despite its hardships, had given him something precious, a bond with his daughter that was stronger than anything else. As he looked toward the future, he knew there would be new beginnings, perhaps even new love, but for now, he was content, grateful for the lessons he'd learned, the love he'd found, and the unwavering loyalty of the little girl who had saved him from a lifetime of heartache. Over the next year, Thomas and Sophie settled into a comfortable rhythm, one that revolved around the simple joys of life, sharing meals, laughing at silly jokes, and exploring their neighborhood on long walks. Thomas found himself embracing single fatherhood with a newfound sense of peace and purpose, focusing on building a life filled with honesty, love, and security for his daughter. As he healed, Thomas began to venture out of his comfort zone, reconnecting with old friends and attending social gatherings. At first, he felt reluctant, wary of opening himself up to new people after everything that had happened with Isabella. But slowly, his confidence returned. He reminded himself that not everyone had ulterior motives, and that true, genuine connections were still possible. One afternoon, Mark invited Thomas to a small get-together at a cafe in town. It was just a casual gathering with a few close friends, and Thomas decided it was time to go, to let himself reconnect with the world outside of his close-knit family life. As he arrived at the cafe, he took a deep breath, trying to push down any lingering anxieties. He spotted Mark near a corner table, chatting with a few people. Among them was a woman he hadn't met before, a woman who, as she turned and caught his eye, smiled warmly. Rachel Turner was a friend of Mark's from college, a school teacher with a passion for helping young children and a natural warmth that put everyone around her at ease. She was in her early 30s, with curly brown hair, kind hazel eyes, and a gentle smile. When Mark introduced them, Rachel extended her hand confidently. "Hi, Thomas. I've heard a lot about you from Mark," she said, her voice friendly and genuine. Thomas shook her hand, feeling an unexpected sense of ease wash over him. "All good things, I hope?" he replied with a small smile. "Oh, absolutely," she laughed, "mostly about what a great dad you are and the amazing work you do in the community." They began talking, sharing stories of their work and their mutual love for coffee. Rachel's presence was comforting, and Thomas found himself relaxing, enjoying the conversation, unlike his interactions with Isabella, which had often felt like a whirlwind of excitement and intensity. Talking to Rachel was calm, genuine, and easy. As the afternoon went on, Thomas found himself captivated by Rachel's warmth and authenticity. She listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions, and even laughed at his dry humor. By the time they left the cafe, Thomas couldn't help but feel a spark of hope, one that reminded him of how it felt to connect with someone on a deep, meaningful level. Over the next few weeks, Thomas and Rachel kept in touch, exchanging texts and meeting for coffee or lunch whenever their schedules allowed. Their friendship blossomed naturally, without the pressures or expectations that had defined his relationship with Isabella. With Rachel, he felt safe, as though he could be himself without fear of judgment or disappointment. Sophie met Rachel during a weekend outing that Thomas arranged to a nearby botanical garden. Initially, Sophie was reserved, her natural shyness keeping her at a distance. But Rachel had a gentle way with children. And soon, she was pointing out different types of flowers to Sophie, explaining their names and encouraging her to ask questions. By the end of the day, Sophie was laughing and holding Rachel's hand, fascinated by her stories. Watching them together, Thomas felt his heart swell. He hadn't realized how much he wanted this, for Sophie to connect with someone who genuinely cared about her. Rachel wasn't trying to win Sophie over for Thomas's sake, she was simply being herself, treating Sophie with kindness and respect. In that moment, he felt a mixture of gratitude and joy, knowing that he had finally found someone who valued him for who he was and accepted his family without hesitation. As time passed, Rachel became a regular presence in their lives. She would join them for dinners, help Sophie with her homework, and even attend Sophie's school events. Slowly, they became a family that, while not conventional, was filled with love, understanding, and mutual support. After a year of friendship and companionship, Thomas found himself wanting to take his relationship with Rachel to the next level. It wasn't a decision he made lightly. He had spent months reflecting on his past mistakes, understanding his own worth, and rediscovering what he truly wanted in a partner. With Rachel, he felt he had found not just a partner, but a friend and confidant who would stand by him through life's highs and lows. One evening, while Sophie was spending the night at a friend's house, Thomas invited Rachel over for a quiet dinner. They cooked together, sharing laughter and stolen glances, enjoying the simplicity of each other's company. After dinner, they sat in the living room, sipping tea and talking about their dreams for the future. As the night grew quieter, Thomas took a deep breath, gathering the courage to open his heart once more. "Rachel," he began softly, taking her hand in his. "I never thought I'd have the chance to feel this way again. You've brought so much light and happiness into my life. And I can't imagine my future without you in it." Rachel's eyes filled with warmth as she smiled, squeezing his hand. "Thomas, I feel the same way. You and Sophie have become like family to me. Being with you, it just feels right." With her words, a weight lifted from Thomas's heart. He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, a silent promise of the love and respect he would offer her in their journey ahead. Several months later, Thomas and Rachel gathered their closest friends and family for an intimate wedding ceremony. Unlike his first attempt, this wedding was simple and meaningful, focused on the love they shared and the commitment they were making to each other and to Sophie. Sophie served as Rachel's flower girl, her face glowing with excitement as she walked down the aisle, tossing petals with each step. When she reached the front, she took Thomas's hand, looking up at him with pride and love. Thomas felt a lump in his throat, overwhelmed by how much his daughter had grown and by the strength she had shown through everything they'd been through. As Rachel walked down the aisle, Thomas felt his heart swell with gratitude. This time, he knew he was making the right choice, not because of appearances, but because of love, trust, and respect. He was marrying someone who had shown him kindness and compassion, who had become a mother figure to Sophie, and who understood the depth of his love for his daughter. The ceremony was filled with laughter and tears as Thomas and Rachel exchanged vows, promising to support each other through all of life's challenges. Sophie stood by their side, holding both of their hands as they made their vows, a symbol of the family they had built together. After the ceremony, as they celebrated with friends and family, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. He had found the love he had once thought lost, and he knew that this time, it was built on a foundation that would last. Years passed, and Thomas, Rachel, and Sophie grew closer as a family. Sophie thrived under Rachel's guidance and love, growing into a confident and compassionate young woman. She excelled in school, pursued her passions, and became a constant source of joy and pride for Thomas and Rachel. Looking back, Thomas felt grateful for the twists and turns life had thrown his way. While his journey had been marked by heartbreak and betrayal, it had ultimately led him to a place of fulfillment and happiness. He had learned the importance of honesty, trust, and patience. And he had built a life filled with people who loved him unconditionally. One summer evening, as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Thomas took Rachel's hand, his heart brimming with love. "I never thought I'd get a second chance at this," he whispered, glancing at Sophie, who was laughing with a friend nearby. "But I'm so glad I did." Rachel leaned her head against his shoulder, smiling softly. "You deserved it, Thomas. And I'm so grateful that I get to share this life with you and Sophie." As they sat together in the fading light, Thomas felt a sense of contentment that he had never known before. He had found a love that was honest, resilient, and true, a love that had endured life's trials and had emerged stronger. The pain and betrayal of the past no longer haunted him. Instead, they had become stepping stones that had led him to the life he now cherished, a life filled with love, family, and a future he was excited to share with the people who mattered most. And as he held Rachel's hand, with Sophie by their side, Thomas knew that he had finally found the peace and happiness he had been searching for all along.